I needed so badly until I saw it. And by that, I meant to myself, and I think for many of us, just didn't know how much we needed a good love story in this day and age. And in the end, a love story that left me optimistic. Yes, there's turbulence. Yes, there's trauma. But in the end, I came out feeling optimistic about life. And I'm wondering, is that a totally naive reading on my part, or is that something that you had hoped?
No, you're my perfect audience. of one, maybe. No, I feel uplifted by such endings too, and yeah, and it's true that these two characters who are misguided characters who don't really fit together socially, temperamentally, and history plays its tricks on them. That in the end they realize that they have nobody but each other. It's kind of yeah, it's kind of sublime, yeah, and it's true that
It's heavily romantic somehow.
yeah.
But I mean, I think for me, I also started out saying that 2018 has been such an insane year in so many levels, but it's also we're living in turbulent times again. And I think to see this portrait, which is obviously set in a different period, but to see this now somehow felt urgent. And I don't know if you thought about that at all, about the context in which your film would be read.
Not so much, but I feel my own urge for these stories, you know, and part of the reason why I went back to Poland to make films, but also went back in time. It's out of this urge to tell these kind of stories, which are kind of transcend time, but where you know, the emotional life is not ruled by the digital world, where things happen for real and have huge consequences. You know, where you know, there's not a world of multiple choice. You know, so I definitely have that you know, desire to see it and to make it. You know, and to show it rather. So and the reaction of audiences, also to Ida, but to this one even more, shows that there is a real craving for that too. And not just the story, but also, you know, just the way you make films, the idea of hand making films in a non-industrial way, also seems to have a you know, a good impact on audiences, because they feel it's kind of, there's nothing kind of industrial, you know. It's not a film where you can feel the division of labor. This is the script, this is the photography, this is the music, this is everything kind of was brought together in a very amateurish, old-fashioned fashion.
Hardly amateurish, but old-fashioned can be good. I didn't read anything about this film. I obviously knew your work and knew who you were and what you were capable of before I saw it, but I didn't know until afterwards how deeply personal this film is or may be. And so I hope we can talk a little bit about that. I have a quote, you've spoken about it a bit in the press, but so on the background of the film, you've described your parents as, and you can tell me if this is a false quote, but the most interesting dramatic characters I've ever come across, both strong, wonderful people, but as a couple, a never-ending disaster.
More or less, yeah. That was, I
so
can subscribe to that.
How close is this? How is this interpretation, this dramatic interpretation, the cinematic interpretation of your parents?
It's pretty close in the mechanics, the way they meet, and he's 10 years older and seems like an authority. She's this hot-headed young woman, and the way they react to each other, they read or misread each other, then the separation, then reuniting abroad and discovering that they're not quite what they remember or what they imagined about each other, and of course exile changes. All that happened to my parents. All these splitting up and getting back together, marrying other people, leaving the country, dumping other people, getting back together again, all that kind of stuff, you know. It's much more messy than here. But also at the end of the 40 years of this kind of stuff, this was only 15 years. mainly because I didn't want to change actors halfway. But at the end of it all, they were too tired to fight. They're both quite ill and tired, and they were the most touching, loving couple you can imagine. They were holding hands, and the whole world was kind of passing them by, and they didn't care. You know, they had nobody but each other.
Beautiful.
So so it was a great love story at the end of the story, you know, but it didn't look like it.
You got to stick with it till the end. That's the point. So let's talk about your actors. When you were casting Wiktor and Zula, I mean, did you have something in your mind? How do you reconcile this portrait of something so intimate, right, as parents, onto characters, onto actors that you're then casting for this type of project?
I wasn't so literal about the resemblance, you know. I just wanted the mechanics to be similar and the contrast between them to be clear. It so happens that my mother was blonde, very Slav, and kind of temperamental and so on, and musical. She was a ballerina. She ran away to the ballet rather than to. Although she did dance in a folk ensemble too at some point. And my father was tall, dark, more phlegmatic. So these two kind of correspond type-wise. But then I forgot that it's anything to do with my parents and just kind of, you know, and dealt with what's possible in cinema. You know, I mean, you don't want to be literal about everything. And when I was writing, I already imagined that Joanna was in the right ballpark. For one thing, she could sing. I'd worked with her on 2 previous films, and in one of them, in Ida, she did nothing but sing. She was the pop singer in Ida. And in The Woman in the Fifth, she has a little moment where she also sings. But anyway, she could sing, but also she had that kind of energy, this kind of honesty, cynicism mixed with romanticism in a very peculiar way. And she was this type who could, you know, declare her love, and then the guy walks off, so she said, well, fuck you then, and just goes the other way and jumps into the river or falls off a bar, you know, that kind of stuff. You know, these kind of twists. So she was, you know, pretty early on in my mind as the perfect lead. For the man, I was for a while thinking of using a real musician to have that musical relationship, that magic of that relationship in front of our eyes. But after a while, I realized that most of the musicians I considered couldn't act or didn't have the right aura. So I went for a professional, a very good actor, Tomasz, who I'd seen in some things, where he didn't play this kind of Gregory Peck type leading man, but I could see he's got it somehow. If you give him the right hairstyle, light him, and, you know, in a certain way. So then brought them together, you know, we spent a lot of time kind of just meeting, talking about the film. I sent them off to dance lessons so they would get familiar with each other. You know, and in the end, they became the thing. You know, I forgot it's anything to do with my parents. You know, I was working with this material that I had, and they had their own autonomous, you know, life from now on.
So pushing a little further on the music, I mean, I'd like to hear more about your collaborators on that front, but also, I mean, traditional folk song and jazz are quite specific. I mean, it's not just that, you know, they had to sing, and to be able to perform these or even act as performers in these, what was the preparation for like with that, and how closely did they collaborate with your musical collaborators on that front?
Well, first of all, I had to kind of choose the music, you know, so I chose 3 songs from the repertoire of a folk ensemble that really exists, Mazowsze. And I chose 3 songs that could work as, if you could kind of bring them back to like source music, in a kind of primitive version, which we hear at the beginning of the film. And then they worked in their kind of folk ensemble, this kind of fake lore version with orchestra and choreography. And then all these tunes also worked as jazz numbers, you know, the lyrical song as a kind of jazzy chanson. The oberek, a kind of wild dance from central Poland, became a bebop number in Paris. So in order to transform them into jazz, I worked with a great musician who was actually, I met him because I thought he could play the lead, which he couldn't. But I kind of just got to know him and realized he's a really interesting kind of jack of all trades musician. And he did the adaptations of into jazz. That's all he did. And then I found these folk performers around Poland, interesting faces and voices, and asked them to sing the same songs at the front of the film in their own version to make it, to authenticate that folk music. And Joanna went through the whole process of learning. I mean, she's a singer. She sings quite a lot, kind of pop songs mainly. But she spent some time with this folk ensemble Mazowsze to learn how they sing more kind of with a trained kind of almost operatic voice. The folk singing she could do anyway, the kind of very basic that she sings at the beginning because she comes from a village in the mountains and she actually can do that stuff. And then we worked with a jazz vocalist on trying to create that kind of husky, smoky voice that she has in Paris. She also spent a lot of time learning to dance because she'd never danced before. So she spent half a year going twice a week to this folk ensemble to learn the choreography, the steps, but also the mentality of a collective. It really became not just about dancing and singing, but it became about the character of Zula and existing in that group.
I mean, what she does, obviously, clearly, it's a huge amount of work, but the payoff is just incredible. I mean, people are talking, this is a star-making performance. It's kind of beyond that. I mean, what she's able to do is transcend genre, right? I mean, it's beyond cinema, it's beyond musical performance. It really is kind of channeling this person through. So I want to open it up to the audience for questions, so get them ready. But just one before we switch over. So, and just to quickly talk about the construction of the film. So we won't go into the black and white. We don't need to ask those questions. Everybody's making black and white films after Ida, so you set that up. But the 4:3 framing, I do want to go into that and how it might also feed into this kind of, you said old-fashioned, but like not in a negative sense, but in the kind of nostalgia for great cinema that existed in this frame previously, but also the constricted nature of this framing in a contemporary setting where we're used to the wide frame, and so putting your characters in this smaller, almost box, and how that was strategic for you.
Well, it wasn't. The reason wasn't nostalgia. It was. But for me, it's not such an eccentric format because I used to make documentaries on 16mm and before Super 16 was invented. So that was kind of norm for a long time. But what it helps me already in Ida and here is to limit the field of vision, to guide exactly where the viewer is looking, and to work by not showing too much and by suggesting what's out of frame. In Ida, the camera didn't move, so a lot was suggested. Here, the camera moves at some points and suddenly reveals what you were missing. It's a great format for portraits and double portraits, and I think it gives me more control of what I show, But what we lose on the sides, very often we compensate for in depth, We especially in this film, put the camera very often quite high to have layers behind, and kind of have all these worlds, I mean, the story is about a couple that. It's kind of intimate, two-hander in some ways, but also it's an epic story where they kind of go through different worlds, So these worlds were all there in the back. But the perfect example of why this Academy format works is the scene on the river where you start with two faces, and then he rises, she rises, the camera follows. He leaves, she walks off and suddenly goes wide and then she comes back, so it gives you much more flexibility what you can show and when.
Control, we like it. Okay, so our ushers will help us with questions. I think I saw one on. Let's do. Yeah, we can do one up front, and then we'll go to each side.
Hi there. I was just wondering if you could give us a little bit of an insight into your process, and particularly in this film, because it's maybe biographical, the empathy that's different with these actors. Thank you.
The process, I've been very formed by my documentary making from long, long ago, where I worked without a script and just kind of sculpted the film as I went along. And I've never unlearned that approach, So I still, write the story, write the script, usually quite a short, 60 pages maximum. I'm told that it's more like 40 pages with a lot of spacing. So I leave a lot of space for film, for cinema, and I basically keep going back on myself and revising and rewriting. There are like 179 versions of this script, because I spend a lot of time with the film, preparing it, location scouting, and we scouted for months and months all around Poland, and not only. And all this time is thinking time. Of course, you invent the story, you write it down, but the deeper you get into that territory, the world, the locations, the actors, the casting process, some rehearsals or just readings, the film grows in you all the time. And you get bored with some things which were not strong enough. And that I carry into filming. During the filming, I tend to have 5-day weeks with 1 day rest and 1 day for editing and rewriting. So the film is constantly growing on my parallel, and I tend to forget the script and concentrate more on this film, this kind of documentary that's growing on the side. And I know that some scenes that were in the script actually they no longer live up to the film, and I have to come up with something better. So there's a lot of flexibility during the filming process. It was helped also in this case by the fact that we moved locations a lot. So there were, and we also waited for seasons to change. So I had 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month-long gap, which helped me kind of get into the film deeper and eliminate some so-so scenes, some bad lines, come up with better stuff. So it's a kind of open process, and it's pretty chaotic. The actors have to get used to the fact that they might wake up and there's a slightly new scene or new dialogue in the morning. But I try to make everyone feel part of this sculpting process, so they don't treat it like an industrial process where there's a script and then we execute it professionally. And everyone gets used to this kind of slightly floating approach, and it helps me really live my film and induce that state in others as well. So it's not that we're translating pages of script onto screen, but we're kind of like sculpting it. And when people say, "Oh, it's such a kind of precise, perfect-looking film," little do they know what a chaotic process it is to actually get there. But I have the freedom to get it. I give myself the freedom to actually get it right, and not to be a slave to a faulty script, which I think is the problem with a lot of films.
Let's see. Was there a question on this side that I missed? Maybe on this side.
The politics were the story, at least for me. That a lot of it was my family's story.
In Ida?
In Ida, yes. So, but the politics are there in this story, but I was wondering how important they were to you, because you've talked a lot about the love story, but there's a lot of politics too.
Yeah, but I didn't want to deal with politics up front. I think politics work best when they come out by the way, when they're kind of result of the story, the characters, the emotions. And in this case, you quite you saw how politics impacts on these characters, on the relationships, and I think that's much more that brings politics and history much more alive than if you actually set out to explain history and politics. So it's there, and one of the advantages of this story, apart from it being emotionally interesting and my parents and all that, but it's actually set in interesting times and interesting times that resonate today, again. So of course I had that in the back of my mind, but I never tried to illustrate anything, I never tried to show how evil the communist system is, and show, only insofar as it impacts on our story, I show it. And I think that's more effective. But I had the feeling that I did the same in Ida. I didn't treat it as a political story. I thought it was like an interesting existential tale, Ida. Of course, history plays a huge part in it. But I didn't make Ida to explain history either. It was more about what goes on in this, in the heads of my characters.
So then I had a question, which was in a way a follow-up, is what has the reception been in Poland, for example? I mean, a lot of times people are very jealous or very guarded with their history or their appreciation for their understanding of history. And so I'm wondering, layering on the political history that is a backdrop for this film, but for many might be quite real, and was there any pushback on your interpretation of that history or the use of it?
Ida became a political punch bag, because it was when it came out, nobody noticed. It was a black and white art house film with very complicated characters, and nothing was so clear. There was a lot of paradoxes in Ida as well. So nobody noticed until it started being successful at festivals, and it won awards, and then the Oscar. And there was the time of the elections in Poland, and the party that's now in power needed all the ammunition they could find. So they said, look at this film. You haven't seen it, no problem. We'll tell you it's an anti-Polish film, and it's about how Poles persecuted Jews during the war, which is totally untrue. It never happened. And the reason it's successful is because there's a conspiracy against our country, and who rules Hollywood. So basically they used it as a tool, and they started a petition against the film, which was signed by more people than actually saw the film in Poland. Their electorate doesn't go to see such films, but they kind of explained what it is and explained the success away. So the actual reaction to the film in Poland was by this small art house audience that saw it, maybe 250,000 people, was fine. It's what happened with its success that became a problem. And then I said a few things, and I became a controversial figure, and so on. And now they're in power. I don't want to go into politics, but it's not looking great. And this film, it has echoes of today, and the way the Ministry of Culture, Stalinist Ministry of Culture, tries to co-opt the folk ensemble, rings a bell, today. And in fact, the very folk ensemble I based this one on, Mazowsze, they've just been given huge subsidies by the Ministry of Culture as the Polish national art, as opposed to decadent theaters and controversial films. So there are a lot of parallels, and a character like Kaczmarek, the communist careerist you see there, these guys are running the show now in Poland. These guys who learn a certain language. Back then it was Marxist-Leninist, now it's patriotic, and you can go a long way with when you've mastered the lingo. So I put it's all there, but it's too subtle. The electorate doesn't get these illusions. So the film is not terribly controversial, I'm afraid. And what's more, it's actually very popular because of the love story, the rediscovery of folk music. because it was a bit of a laughing stock, this kind of official folk music. The jazz, I don't know, but and also the condition of exile, which a lot of people in Poland kind of relate to, how you become somebody else, how you kind of humiliated by exile. And so there's a lot of things that seem to have hit a chord, and the film is actually quite a popular film.
Let's see if there's one more in the middle. I see hands all over. You guys can pick.
So I just want to ask you about the music in the film. It was an incredible musical experience, actually. But one thing I couldn't help noticing is your use of music in transitions. And I thought I heard the chaconne playing in the background when he's getting up to go back to Poland. And I just was wondering how you use music in transition.
With the chaconne, it was just I just needed it was, but I just needed some subtle sound in the empty courtyard to highlight the silence. So, and chaconne was just a choice. It wasn't, there in the script. It was just like, what do we do to make this silence resonate? But the music, a lot of the musical choices were quite perverse. For example, in Split, in Yugoslavia, our folk ensemble, they play a Yugoslav song. Actually, it's a Serbian song, which they would have hated in Croatia, But so Kaczmarek got the wrong end of the stick completely. It's a song beloved of Radovan Karadzic, Svilan Konac. So, and also the musical that Zula sings at the beginning. It's a Soviet musical. Wesołe Rebiata. It's Dunajewski was the composer. He was Stalin's favorite composer. So here we have this girl who doesn't know any folk songs. She just picked one up in the corridor, but she doesn't know this Soviet musical, which Wiktor and Irena would have hated. Because the Soviets are ruling, but everyone kind of resented their presence. And what else? Then you have Gershwin, that kind of seduction scene. It was quite and that gives you, it's about them coming together and how he lays the chords and she intuits the melody that she can't have possibly have heard in 1949 Poland. But it gives you the idea that he's been in the West, that he actually knows Gershwin and stuff, So you can, there's a lot of kind of little decisions that kind of give you information, and sometimes they're quite kind of perverse and ironic. Or the song that, when Wiktor is waiting for Zula in Berlin, and she's at the bar and doesn't join him, and there's a girl sitting on the bar playing accordion and singing Katyusha. So you have the Poles and East Germans dancing together to a Russian song, So when you have the choice, you can plant a lot of little things like that, and some people get it, or they get it subliminally somehow, that there's something that's a world out of. It's like there's full of little ironies and paradoxes, but these things are totally what would have happened at the time. It's not my kind of contrivances. This is all totally possible.
Well, again, I want to thank you for showing us what maybe we didn't know we needed and now we're in love with. So thank you so much. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Don't let him handle me and drive me mad. If you can keep me, I wanna stay with you forever, and I'll be glad. Yes, I love you, Poggy. Don't let him take